Humanity pretty much operates on a win-lose paradigm. Somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. And in order for somebody to win, somebody has to lose in the paradigm that we're living in. And this is, this I think many people don't question that. We need to win the election. We need to win, more people to see men and women the same way, or the economy the same way, or religion the same way.
What if the truth came in a gel cap and we could just pop it in our mouths and forget about it? Well, it doesn't, and we can't. But we can laugh in the face of reality while plotting our survival. Welcome to the Truth Tastes Funny podcast. I am your host, Hirsch Redpun, and if my guests can handle the truth, so can you. Open wide, folks. Here it comes. Well, my guest today on Truth Tastes Funny could not be joining us at a better time. Her name is Phyllis Leavitt. Phyllis is the author of America in Therapy, A New Approach to Hope and Healing for a Nation in Crisis. It's published by Morgan James Publishing. She explores the roots of divisiveness and violence in America from a psychological point of view, with the goal of bringing the best of what heals relationships and restores us to safety into the national conversation. And I'm really happy to have you with us today, Phyllis.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. And I'm excited to have this conversation because now more than ever, it seems like so urgent that we look for a different way to run our affairs with each other and address the problems that we face.
Yeah, thank you. And and it's interesting because we've spoken before when we orchestrated the interview, we were in one place in the
Right.
world, and when I started this podcast, we were in another place, and now here we are in yet another place. And one of the themes that keeps coming up for me as I interview people is the fact that chaos and miscommunication and confusion, all of this stuff just seems to be cycling through or never ending, really. We one or more of us can get some of what we want, in this country politically, but that's
Mhm.
usually fleeting. And it's been that way for decades. What do you attribute this crisis, not just today's crisis, the crisis of the moment, or even crises of the moment? What do you attribute the divisiveness to overall?
Well, there's so many ways to go into that question, and I try to go into so many angles in my book because there are many. But one of them that I would say is I think we have to look at, when people come to therapy, their lives are not working. Something's not working, and it's usually in some kind of relationship, either with themselves or the people closest to them, or in their business, or in their creative life, or with their children. Something is causing them enough pain that they can't find the answer themselves, and they're looking for professional help to sort out the roots of and the cures, or what to do about what's causing them that pain. And inevitably, we find in the field of psychology that the roots of violence and abuse and pain and disruption and unresolved conflict and addiction and depression and anxiety and all the things that people suffer from come from some wound in our early relationships, some wound to love, some wound to safe belonging, some wound to feeling valued or being provided for. And we look at the roots of that. And I think one of the things that we can look at for America is that we are a nation primarily made up of immigrants, people who were fleeing trauma, who were fleeing injustice, who were fleeing war, poverty, religious persecution. And I don't know that we think about that we actually have inherited a huge amount of untreated and undiagnosed intergenerational trauma, and it's really showing up. And I think the more power that people are able to wield, even if it's just a few people, then the magnitude of what that unhealed trauma can perpetrate on large numbers of people is out of sight. And I think that's part of what we're dealing with. The other big thing I want to say, and of course, I have 100 things I could say, but the other big thing I want to say is that I think humanity, and not just America, but certainly America, with the kind of politics that we've developed over the last, since we've been a country, humanity pretty much operates on a win-lose paradigm. Somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. And in order for somebody to win, somebody has to lose in the paradigm that we're living in. And this is, this I think many people don't question that. We need to win the election. We need to win, more people to see men and women the same way, or the economy the same way, or religion the same way, or whatever it is we do. And that paradigm really is, I think, in desperate need of shifting to a win-win. Because in the world of psychology, we don't operate on a win-lose paradigm. If a couple comes to therapy, we're not out to have one of the partners win and the other one lose. Because we know in the field of psychology that the win-lose paradigm destroys relationship.
Yeah, you've said so much of value there, Phyllis. First of all, let's start with the trauma.
Right,
Um, that makes total sense because so much of our country is made up of people who were fleeing trauma, and it doesn't have to be they themselves that were fleeing. My family fled the Nazis. I
right,
didn't flee the Nazis. I grew up in Miami Beach in a wonderful, warm, and happy home. But my parents inherited trauma.
that's right.
My father was 4 or 5 years old when they escaped Germany, but all of that stuff is in our
That's
DNA.
right. That's right.
And then another part of that is because of the win lose paradigm, you feel like you need to blame someone else if you're unhappy. And
Totally.
so and that's part of that because if you lose in some way and the other person wins, you resent it
That's right.
versus compromising and working together. One thing I'm seeing now is that because what's happening right now, you know, indisputably affects everybody regardless of who they voted for, right?
Right.
Now they
Right.
may not recognize it yet, or they may, there may be arguments over strategy and so forth. But if there's a bad outcome on a daily basis, it's affecting people
That's right.
across the country. So the hope is that this presents an opportunity for win-win problem solving. Because
Right.
if you look at what happened previously over the last 2 decades, the parties have been so far apart with this win-lose dynamic and just thinking they just want to destroy what the other person wants,
Right.
and combat the other person. I think that's largely why there's no united front. If there were a united front, now let's look to the problem solving aspect. If if people were to kind of come together in therapy, right? In that notion, what would be the first step?
Well, I think one of the models that I use in my book that I think is really powerful, and it was actually part of the motivation for me to write the book, is that in psychotherapy today, we are steeped in family dynamics. And most of us know that if you have two adults in a family who are fighting all the time, not only do they suffer, but their children really suffer and they become symptomatic. And so I call us the family of America because what I see is that all groups of people operate on family dynamics, no matter how large or small that group of people is. And if you have people at the top of a country constantly embittered and in battle and trying to put each other down and vilify each other. We have a whole country that's suffering, whether you're red or blue. And of course, some people feel that more than others. And that's often the people who have less means or who are more marginalized because of differences of religion and skin and whatever else we have. But it's a family dynamic that we're looking at. And in a healthy family, you don't try to, like I was saying before, you don't try to have the husband beat out the wife or the wife beat out the husband in the argument. You help them listen to each other and build empathy for each other and deep understanding and foster a commitment to compromise and deep listening and resolution. And if they really can't resolve their differences, and that happens a lot with people, then we really, advocate that people leave each other alone in peace and not keep visiting their animosity on their children and making them divide and who which parent do they want to be with or who do they love the most. And we're seeing the same thing play out here. So what I think it's really important to look at us as a family and what makes a healthy family. A healthy family is committed to nonviolence. A healthy family doesn't beat each other up verbally, emotionally, physically, or sexually assault each other when they have a conflict. They restrain their most angry, hurt impulses for the good of the whole. And I think that model of how do you balance the good of individuals with the good of the whole and a commitment to the principles that are the most healthy is what our country and really the world desperately needs, because we are arming ourselves not only psychologically and mentally and emotionally in our country with our violence and our violent rhetoric, but with actual arms
Yeah.
that could wipe us all out. So what better motivation could we have to be in
Yeah.
therapy as a country?
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. And the family analogy is apt because, when you think about it, it's like our parents, quote unquote, the people who have been, let's say running the country or the creating the atmosphere in the country, as long as there's this notion of hatred and vilification, it's going to be that thing like a parent that encourages their kids to fight it out so that they'll get tough or whatever. And
That's right.
and let's say they have different reasons for doing it. In some cases they're just rooted in conflict. In other cases they it actually serves their needs to have the electorate just be totally at odds with one another, blame one another, right? Blame the other. So, and now it seems we also have, people have likened the environment, or the authoritarian, tendency to Hitler, but in fact, what people need to, I think, understand is that it may be very similar, but it's different players this time. In other words, anti-Semitism has risen, of course, but that's not necessarily the immediate scapegoat, right? There's all kinds of minorities. There's what, you know what this administration might, term good Jews and bad Jews. There's it's not a mirror image of Germany, but it's a playbook that history has provided us information for.
Right.
But but I want to be clear that I feel a lot of the lack of communication is the emotionally ratcheted up kind of hysteria on all sides, because that regardless, it's like that we don't know, it doesn't serve us to be combative
Right.
with
Exactly.
one another, because no matter how you slice it, the neighbor down the street with the Trump sign on his lawn didn't actually create the situation. They merely responded to it or became part of it for reasons that probably don't aren't explained by tariffs and mass firings and taking away Medicare and Medicaid and all those things, that that isn't necessarily what they wanted. And so we have to look at these counterparts as, whichever side anyone's on, as a sibling who who has also not gotten what they wanted, really.
Hmm.
But how do you counter disinformation when people are getting their information from only the sources that validate what they already think? How do they even come to realize that they need therapy? It's kind of like an addict, that as long as they're in a crack den, they're gonna keep they're gonna keep shooting up,
Right, right. Well, I don't think there's a direct answer to misinformation. The spread of massive misinformation is a symptom. It's also a cause, but it's a symptom. And I think what the world of psychology has to really offer is, where do these symptoms come from? What causes them to grow? Why are people so invested in not hearing another side of the story and only hearing what feeds what they've already heard? Because I think, again, in a healthy family, in a healthy relationship between a couple, or an employer and an employee, or in a house of worship, there's a place for everybody's voice, more or less. And we don't do it perfectly. Sometimes we fight and sometimes we really disagree, but there is a bottom line understanding that people are entitled to have different opinions. And in a healthy family, we're listening for the value in what other people say. We're not listening just to make them wrong or shout them down. And so often, like when a couple comes to therapy or a family comes to therapy where they're having problems with their children, they're not listening because
Mhm.
they're so invested in having their own point of view be the only one that's at the table. And we really have people. One of the things that I think is so sad, and there's a million things that are so sad about what's happening in our country today, is that there are so many people that have a valuable contribution to make. People who know a lot about the economy, people who know a lot about the environment, people who know a lot about educating children, people who know about sexual differences and men-women relationships and the divide between, men and women psychologically. I mean, there's a million issues that people have expertise in, the medical field, the science field. And in a healthy family, there's a place for these different voices and these different contributions. And by silencing each other and being invested in this win-lose paradigm, and which is really a domination and suppression paradigm. Win-lose means I win and you lose, I dominate you and you have to shut up, the way we're enacting it now. We've lost so much of our contribution that so many human beings have to make. And so, this is one of the big principles, I think, of a healthy family, and what good therapy really helps people learn: listening skills, restraining their own impulse to dominate, taking responsibility for their own behavior and their own actions, healing the wounds that are generating their dysfunctional behaviors, being committed to nonviolence and conflict resolution so that we can reconnect. These are the principles, some of the principles of a healthy family. And when you don't have that, and you mentioned some of this earlier, you have more and more people who are blamed for the abuses of power in their family. So I use the model of an abusive family, just a nuclear family, and look at the country through that model. An abuser in a family is most likely an untreated victim of their own abuse that they're replaying on the family members that they have control over. One of the hallmarks of that dynamic is an abuser always blames their victims for the abuse. They always
Mhm.
have a justification. She wore that short skirt. She was asking for it. He talked back, so I beat him. He failed in school, so I locked him in his room. Whatever it is, there's always a justification and a complete lack of personal accountability for their own behavior and any desire to change. And this is
Yeah.
becoming entrenched on a societal level that we just keep looking for who to blame and blame them for the abuses that are being perpetrated on them.
Yeah. And one of the things that I keep thinking of is how once someone has been, indoctrinated into that abusive, dynamic, they believe now, they believe the abuser now.
Right.
They have reasoned that this radical point of view or whatever, they have now been radicalized. Let's just leave it. That's the easiest way to look at it. They've been radicalized. Once someone is radicalized, and not everyone who voted for Donald Trump, let's say, is radicalized. Of course not. But those who are, how do you bring people back from that place, and then on a lesser level to even admit that they were wrong is a hard thing. So they
Right.
may not be radicalized, but they may just have been, okay, I this is great. I'm doing this, and then be like, oh my God, what did I do? That may not be so easy to do. So
Mhm.
those change that bringing about those that change. How do you get there?
I have 100 things I want to say.
I
So
know, I could
gotta
tell.
like focus my brain here. Well, one of the things that I think that is desperately missing from our social structure and our political structure that you find in the best psychology is that it's based in non-judgment. Nobody goes to a therapist who's going to say, God, you're a bad person because you did that, because you
Yeah,
said that. We look for the roots of dysfunction and we really try to heal that part of the person that adopted that dysfunctional or abusive or hurtful, and it might be even self-hurtful behavior as well as hurtful to other people. So the model that was created in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation model, is something that we desperately need to find a way to bring into public conversation. There were people in South Africa, as most of us know, who committed horrible atrocities and were terribly, terribly unjust and discriminatory and, all the things that they did that were violent and murderous. And the Truth and Reconciliation model brought whoever was willing, and not everybody was willing, to the table who was a perpetrator with immunity so that they could sit in the presence of people who were the victims of their abuse and hear the impact of what they did with the design that they could begin to take some accountability for their perpetration. And they did that in a place of safety. And we have a model in our country that is shame and blame and punishment with no commitment to rehabilitation, not real rehabilitation. Because, one, again, and I'll say this, I said this before, but I'll say it again because I don't think it's common knowledge. Inside the perpetrator is an unhealed victim.
yeah,
And if we don't really commit to healing victim on all levels and rehabilitation whenever possible of our worst offenders, we can't break this cycle. We can't. Because just as you said, for instance, like in an abusive family, most perpetrators will not admit what they've done. They don't want to go to
yeah,
jail. They don't want to look bad. They don't, they feel justified in what they did, but mostly it's to avoid shame, blame, and punishment. And that does not create a healthy society. It creates defense. And on the largest levels, look at our defense structure and look at our investment in defense rather than as a country being committed to working things out around the world as well as at home.
yeah. And
I
and
know
it
I
may
said a
be
lot. I know I
no,
said a
it's
lot.
good, it's wonderful. But as you were talking about this, it occurred to me that another set of players in this conflict that we're dealing with as a country are enablers.
Right,
So what keeps me up at night sometimes is the fact that there are people aiding and abetting in the abuse
right.
that don't on the face of it seem to truly benefit, like the
Mhm.
GOP, for example. if they didn't like what was happening, they could have stopped it. They could have done all kinds of things everywhere along the way. So they've been enabling this situation. Okay, fair enough if that's what they want. But what do they really get out of it when if you're in an authoritarian regime, their presence as people in Congress is negligent, is negligible. What is who in Putin's government has any real power? Nobody. The oligarchs have their wealth, but only at the pleasure of Putin. He can take it away. So why do people who are either, immensely wealthy themselves or in Congress or both enable this when it would seem like they're actually going to lose power, not gain it?
Well, again, and I talk about this quite at length in my book because again, this whole phenomenon has a lot of its roots in our psychology, and we see this in families all the time. So if you have a family structure that is not healthy, that is operating on discrimination or power over or withholding from certain people and giving to others, and this happens in families of origin as well as larger communities. If you have that going on and there's no escape for the people who are being victimized by those who are in power in the family who are abusive, if there's no escape and there's no help, there's all kinds of symptoms. And we talked about a lot of those symptoms: addiction and depression and acting out and acting in. And, there's a whole roster of them. But in my experience as a therapist, in addition to the individual symptoms that you see, I've seen two main tendencies occur in people that come out of untreated power dynamics that are abusive. And the two main outcomes are either learned helplessness, because it's been, useless to try to fight back or protect yourself or defend yourself or escape. So you learn to be helpless as the best option of how to survive the
Mm-hmm.
abuse, and you become passive and you become unable to stand up for yourself. Learned helplessness becomes a way of life for many people. And the other main outcome is called identification with the aggressor. And it's the opposite. It's those people who have decided, sometimes in very early childhood, that they're not going to be the victim anymore and they're going to fight back. And those are the kids that often become the bully on the playground or target, more vulnerable children in the school system, or have other, aggressive tendencies as teenagers and young adults as they grow up, and sometimes criminal behavior. And so you have these two main tracks that come out of unhealed abuse on the family level, and the same tracks come out of abuse on a national level. More and more people feeling helpless and passive, and more people identifying with the aggressor and want to be like the aggressor, even if it's just for the sense of power, even if there's no gain. That sense of power of identity. Look at the kids who identify with the bully on the playground and support the bully on the playground. They're usually kids who are suffering from a lack of appropriate power and boundaries and love and belonging in their own homes or in their immediate communities and families. And so you have people on a national level who are complicit because either they've identified with the aggressor or they've learned to be helpless and they're afraid to not be complicit, and or you have something in the middle, unfortunately. And this actually takes place in families as well, because I've seen it in my practice. You have those who are actually being rewarded, overtly rewarded by the abuser to comply and to
Mm-hmm.
participate. I worked with a family, an adult who had been in a family where the abusive father gave favor to the other siblings who he wasn't abusing, and and abused this one member of the family, and kind of paid them off. They got more privileges, they got more allowance, and they were even, and this is hard to believe, that these things happen, but they do. He even coerced the siblings into holding this family member down while he beat her. So You grow up in a family like that, what happens to you when you're an adult if you don't have any help? You're going to look for more of the same because you know how to operate in that field. And for many people, they're just trying to avoid more pain.
You know, Phyllis, I think that all of those personalities exist in this national dynamic,
You too.
and that's one of the reasons we are having such a hard time because just like the win-lose paradigm, we're looking at it like, oh well, so and so is evil, so and so is evil, so and so is a terrible person, so and so is a jerk, and that's it. So and so is greedy, so and so, and they may be, but they likely have undergone a different
Right,
process. You
right.
know, you look at the people who pretty much on the face of it spotted Donald Trump's issues from the very beginning. They recognized right away. You know, Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio, all these people. Go to the list. The list is endless. JD Vance and all the they all put out their thoughts, their gut reactions, their honest what they believed, and yet here they are now subservient and enabling,
Hmm.
and they have to generally fall into both of these categories in some cases: the learned helplessness, the idea that they don't want to be abused, and they
Right,
know that they'll be rewarded if they
right,
help. If they
right,
help the aggressor, he'll, you
right.
know, and then the fact that some of them actually have the sense that they are going to empower themselves, even if acting like the aggressor isn't real and it's only fleeting, but they can abuse someone else. They're going to
Hmm.
now abuse someone else because they can, you know, and if we look at the situation honestly, all these people that are now in these positions of authority are vulnerable people. In other words, you didn't, the first administration, there were people that had been chosen for their skills and not just their fealty, but they didn't last. They it didn't work out, but they were there with some credibility, and that's gone. So I guess the challenge is, even in having this conversation, right? If someone were supporting the current administration, or they wouldn't want to hear any of this, because it, as much as I'm not being, you know, I'm not being cold or hateful, they're still, feeling, oh, well, that's just whatever talk. That's just, they would say something like, oh, and Biden wasn't an abuser, or some is a whatabouts, right? And so, is there, as we're kind of coming to a close with this, and we want to leave with a message of what each of us can try to do in our conversations, what
Yeah,
can we do so that we don't have to just avoid one another? Because I think in this moment, coming together is the only solution.
I
That's
agree.
and so how do we even approach one another?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, of course, there's a million things, but a couple of things that come to my mind right away are, we don't have to have a heated political conversation with people that we know have a different frame of mind. What heals is a loving, respectful bond between people. And when people feel loved and respected, they may be able to have that conversation. But in any case, one of the things that we've learned in the field of psychology, and I've certainly learned this in my own life, and I would think many of your listeners and perhaps you have learned the same thing, that the relationship is what's most important. Feeling a sense of safe belonging and respect and being valued and being treated the way we would want to be treated, and therefore treating others the way we want to be treated ourselves, is actually the bottom line of human relationship. And we can tolerate lots of differences of opinion in that kind of environment. So that's the beginning, is really like making relationship primary. And right now it's not. Winning
Yeah.
and losing. Winning is primary. I think I'm sorry to say, but I think exploitation has become primary. Like, what can you get? How much more can you get? And not factoring in the impact that we're having on masses of people who are at the bottom of that totem pole, and then being shocked when there's a mass murder. Like, instead of saying, what happened? What happened in the family of America? What are the dynamics being perpetrated in the family of America or that we're unconscious of that are producing more and more people who are so enraged, who are so depressed, who are so disconnected from their own humanity and the value of human life that they feel like their only option is homicide, suicide. These are essentially mental health, family dynamics issues. And I think they can only be addressed really at their root on that level. And so, what I would love, there's a million things I would love the audience to take away, but one of the things that I've discovered in my own life, and certainly with over 30 years of practicing as a psychotherapist, is that the best access to healing is healing ourselves. I'm going to heal the part of me that identifies with the aggressor, or who has learned to be helpless, or who has a tendency to addiction, or who has become a people pleaser, or who tends to be depressed and inactive. I'm good. If I heal the roots of that wound inside myself, I can be my best contribution to the world and the people around me. And so, but at this point in our history as a country, and I really think as the world, but as a country, the healing ourselves and healing the family of America go hand in hand. Because if you still have massive abuse being perpetrated from the top down, we're just going to create more and more symptomatic people who don't have access to help. But I think, but what can we each do? If someone is feels overwhelmed, and I think a lot of people do feel overwhelmed today and wonder if there's anything that they can do to help, heal yourself. Become a more loving, cooperative, inclusive, tolerant part of our community. Talk that way, behave that way to the people around you, because it spreads. And I think there's definitely a ripple effect of people waking up and saying, we don't want this. We want to live in a safe, loving society. And so we can each contribute to that. And the best access to that is our own personal growth and development.
The book is called America in Therapy, a new approach to hope and healing for a nation in crisis. You can go to Phyllis Leavitt, Leavitt.com, Phyllis Leavitt on Facebook and on Instagram and Twitter, Substack. She's Phyllis Leavitt, Leavitt1. I really encourage you to check out her writings and her books. And also I really love the heal yourself advice, because I think maybe the answer is in looking inward first, because healing ourselves doesn't involve concession, doesn't involve argument, doesn't involve a win-lose. If we heal ourselves, that's a win-win. So thank you, Phyllis, for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure having you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I really, really value talking with you and having this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for tuning into Truth Tastes Funny. If you enjoyed the experience, please leave a 5-star review and share this podcast with your friends.